This video is brought to you in partnership with the Toronto Waterfront BIA. Toronto's waterfront and brand new Portlands district is booming, with new offices, a new river, huge new parks, and huge swaths of housing on the way. But there is one huge missing piece in the puzzle, and that's transit, most notably the Waterfront East LRT. But with the land getting primed for development on the new Villiers Island, and new office tenants moving in along Queen's Quay, now is the time for an integrated plan between the streetcar expansion as well as new rapid transit and GO connections for the eastern waterfront, to take some of Toronto's newest neighborhoods from the least transit connected in the city to the most transit connected. Let's dive in. This is RM Transit, a channel about Toronto's urban development and the transit we should build to help support it. Consider subscribing or supporting me on Patreon to help me bring you more videos. It's been a while since the last time I covered Toronto's waterfront and the new developments sprouting in the area. So before we talk about all of the transit, let's do a quick refresher. Right now Toronto's getting a brand new neighborhood on the brand new Villiers Island, which was created by rerouting the mouth of the Don River, creating not only great flood protection, but also huge green spaces near the river just a stone's throw from downtown Toronto. And since we were last at Villiers Island, a lot has happened. Construction on the basic infrastructure and River Valley is basically done. Many of the majorly rebuilt and realigned streets have been opened. You can cross the various new bridges in the area, and the future mouth of the Don River has been flooded with water to help start getting it on the way to being the actual mouth of the Don River. More information has come out with regard to the plans for the island's many large parks, and plans are being drafted for a beautiful new pedestrian bridge connecting Villiers Island across the Keating Channel to Queen's Quay East, as well as the entirety of the eastern waterfront. The plans for the huge quayside development replacing the previous Sidewalk Labs proposal are also moving forward, and tons of development is happening extending east along Queen's Quay. But there's a problem. The Waterfront East LRT project, which would connect from Bay Street across Queen's Quay East to the Portlands and Villiers Island, still isn't funded, much less under construction, which means that all of these homes and offices, as well as George Brown College, are being left without a dedicated high-frequency rail link. This is especially painful because tons of people are currently cramming on buses to get to the eastern waterfront, and we did the right things. Here's a dedicated streetcar bridge on Cherry Street, and we also set aside space along the streets throughout Villiers Island so that we could build a streetcar from day one. But there are no tracks here, and that has to change. That's because with all of this new development, the opportunity is still there to build the transit while people are still moving in, instead of years later, before they get used to driving to work or just find another job because getting down here is really frustrating. In my previous video about the Waterfront East LRT, I talked about the planned huge expansion to the Union Station and Queen's Quay streetcar facilities in order to accommodate that extension. Now, it remains the case that these huge pieces of infrastructure are delaying the relatively simple surface streetcar tracks heading east on Queen's Quay to extend the existing tracks on the western side. While expanding the stations on the Bay Street Tunnel would certainly be nice, that's hardly necessary to build the Y at the southern end of the Bay Street Tunnel and get the tracks headed further east as soon as possible. We've even seen plans in the last year for how the Yonge Street slip will be partially filled in order to accommodate this. Now, if you've used the streetcar station at Union recently, you'll know it needs some TLC. There's a ton of water leakage, it's extremely crowded, and streetcars back up trying to let people off of the single curved platform. Rebuilding this facility should happen, but that's not going to be a fast process, as it's under Bay Street, which is under the tracks that carry GO trains into Toronto. Expanding the underground streetcar terminal is going to be very complicated, as is connecting it up with CIBC Square and Union Station proper. And I don't think that work should need to happen before the Waterfront East LRT. If you built the new eastern ramp to the Bay Street Tunnel as well as the Waterfront East LRT route before shutting down Union and Queen's Quay to rebuild them, then instead of having to shut down and cut back streetcar service all the way to Spadina, you'd be able to extend service on the Spadina and Harbourfront routes all the way across the waterfront much sooner. Now yes, in this scenario where waterfront streetcar service runs all the way to Villiers Island and then turns around, people going from Union Station to locations along the waterfront would have to walk, but that's better than having no streetcar service at all for the years it will take to rebuild Union and potentially also Queen's Quay. At the same time, it would mean that everyone on the eastern waterfront would get streetcar service sooner, making taking the streetcar the habit instead of driving or taking a bus that might not be there in the future. Ultimately, when the streetcar work is done at Union Station, the Spadina route can be sent back to Union Station and a new route can be created between Villiers Island and Union. But I think all of the talk about Union is kind of part of the problem. I and others complain about neighborhoods like Humber Bay Shores and Liberty Village not having the transit they need, and certainly not when they were first being built. But both of these neighborhoods were already ahead of the waterfront because they already had streetcar links. But such a link shouldn't be seen as the final destination for transit service, but a first step. Streetcars are a good and sometimes even a great solution for local transit, and they could be even better if we took inspiration from cities like Berlin and Amsterdam. But for truly large destinations and neighborhoods like Villiers Island and the eastern waterfront, they're only half of the equation. You also need rapid transit to connect these areas with the rest of the city, not just the local area. And that's really important for equity. Because of all of the amenities being built in the Portlands, they should be accessible not only to just the local area or the broader downtown core, but the entire region. Now, part of the rapid transit solution for the eastern waterfront in the Portlands should be a Cherry Street Ontario Line station. Something which people have been pushing for almost as long as the Ontario line has been an idea. Metrolinx has said such a station doesn't make sense because stations need to be spaced sufficiently so that trains can operate quickly on the line. Now that's an obvious consideration if you've watched my channel for a while, but the reality is the gap between the stations where Cherry Station would go is already really large. Very obvious and substantially smaller are the gaps between Queen and Moss Park Station or Queen Spadina and King Bathurst. The gap here is over 1 kilometer long compared to around 700 meters in other parts of the downtown. And traditionally, downtown Toronto subway stations are as close together as every 400 meters. So the idea that a station here is unprecedented isn't exactly accurate. Now, I've heard people say a station at Cherry isn't necessary because you can walk to Cherry and Lakeshore in 10 to 15 minutes from either of the adjacent stations. But being at the edge of a walkshed of a subway station is reasonable for maybe a 6-story building, not for the enormous amount of density we're going to be putting right at the foot of Cherry. And more importantly, the huge community on Villiers Island that would be the main beneficiary of a station at Cherry Street. For those folks, the walk will be even longer to get to either Corktown or East Harbour Station. And in reality, that might just make transit uncompetitive and make it so that people don't choose that option. Some might say that people can just ride the Waterfront East LRT up to Corktown, which is true, but yet another reason that we need to build the Waterfront East LRT. But for a lot of people, such as those heading east, this will require a frustrating backtrack where you go north and west to get to Corktown and then you go back south and east on the Ontario line to head east. A station at Cherry would just make obvious sense. But how could we actually pay for a station? At the minimum, a provision should have been left along the line where a station could be built in the future, with a section of mostly level track and the correct structure so that a station could be added when it was appropriate down the line. This is similar to what we saw with a bunch of different stations on Vancouver's Canada Line, which were built in from day one, but are actually only being constructed now that funding from nearby developments is pushing those stations forward. I've heard that a station can't work here because the tracks at Cherry are going to be on a grade, and that might be true. But if we really wanted a station, I'm sure we could extend the ramp further to the east or find another way. Not having a design for the alignment that accommodates Cherry Station seems like a weird reason not to build Cherry Station. And maybe with some construction contracts already signed, it is too late. But I think the fact that there's an emergency exit shaft planned for right near Cherry makes it all the more tantalizing. Because if you built the station, you wouldn't need the exit shaft because the section of tunnel wouldn't be over the minimum length in Toronto's standards, and so you'd actually save some money by building the station, which would of course cost more money. And a last-minute addition like this isn't unprecedented. Woolwich Station on London's recently opened Elizabeth line feels similar to Cherry in a number of ways. It's an underground station near the water and where trains pop above ground that was added at the last minute and largely funded by developers who are doing all kinds of development in, around, and on top of the future station site. And in fact, Woolwich has actually been way more successful than anyone could have imagined. At the very least, if we don't have a Cherry Station, I think we should reflect on the fact that we could have, and it might have turned out to be an incredibly busy and popular station just like Woolwich. And that's despite it being a smaller, less expensive station to build. Fortunately, there is another solution, and it's in line with something I've been advocating for a long time: additional downtown GO stations. As the GO train system starts to run more and more like a fast and frequent regional subway, it'll become increasingly obvious that we should have more than just Union Station serving the core of the city. And while on the west we should have a station at Spadina, on the east new stations would provide incredible access to the eastern waterfront as well as the Portlands. Not to mention existing dense neighborhoods like St. Lawrence and the West Donlands. In some ways, stations east of Union are even simpler than one to the west at Spadina. Because since the tracks on the east are on a fairly large and wide rail berm, building a station would simply mean realigning the tracks, building platforms, and then adding stairs and elevators to access it. It wouldn't actually be all that unlike Union Station today. Now, I used to like the idea of a single large station with two huge island platforms between Sherbourne and Parliament that could act like East Harbour as a stop on the Lakeshore East and Kitchener-Stouffville lines to drop people off on the waterfront, allowing easy access down to Sherbourne Common and down Parliament to the Quayside site. But I think another option that's at least worth studying is staggering the platforms, so one is west of Parliament and another is to the east. That means that passengers going to Parliament and Cherry Street could get off at one station, and passengers going to Sherbourne and Parliament could get off at another. Heading in from the west on the Lakeshore line, change trains at Spadina or Union Station to a Stouffville line train to get off at Cherry. And coming from the east on the Stouffville line or the Ontario line, change for a Lakeshore train to get off at Sherbourne. And just in case you're wondering, the distance between East Harbour and a future station at Cherry would be about 800 to 900 meters, which is totally reasonable in the future with electric multiple units running on the GO system. And in some sense, a broader network approach would fix the biggest problem with the Waterfront East LRT. The biggest reason this project is so expensive is because of the major tunnel expansion work going into Union. But if instead of the tunnel expansion, cheaper surface tracks were built across Queen's Quay and up Cherry Street, as well as over to East Harbour in the first phase, you'd really lighten the load at Union and potentially be able to hold off on that expansion work until the future. Instead of sending everyone from Line 1 and the GO lines to the eastern waterfront and Portlands through the congested Union Station streetcar loop, you'd instead have people on GO getting to the eastern waterfront using the Sherbourne, Parliament, and East Harbour stations. From the streetcar system using new tracks on Queen's Quay, Cherry, and Broadview, and from the subway using a combination of GO, streetcar, and the Ontario line. Of course, all of this requires an integrated plan between the streetcar network, the Ontario line, and the GO system. But we clearly need that anyways, and moving in that direction should be a lot simpler thanks to the fare integration deals that we've already started signing. You see, the way the Waterfront East LRT is being looked at is a bit like a Union Station shuttle. And no doubt that connection is useful, but most people's journeys don't start or end at Union Station. And we could probably serve the Portlands and the eastern waterfront better and sooner with a network approach, building more, cheaper tracks sooner instead of funneling everyone through a new and rather expensive upgraded Union Station. But even if this can't happen right away, there's still so much room to consolidate work, so that we can save money and get things built faster. It's hard to over-exaggerate this, but there is a ton of construction going on the eastern waterfront right now, from the Gardner relocation to the Portlands, new developments, and all kinds of other stuff. Right now, Metrolinx is expanding some of the bridges that carry the GO trains through the area, as well as reorganizing the Donyard and the tracks east of Cherry Street for the Ontario line. With the route of the Waterfront East LRT and the potential for future GO stations known, governments from all levels should work together to consolidate the work for building these projects. That way, future projects can be much more plug and play. For example, when all of the work east of Cherry Street for the Ontario line and GO projects is done, they should also pop in the new underpass for the streetcars passing under this section of the rail corridor. The point here is the potential for better transit in the Portlands and along the eastern waterfront is huge, and governments should work together to build it and coordinate it as quickly as possible. We took the risk opening up all this new land for development and parks. Now we should finish the job and provide the transit this area so desperately needs. Thanks for watching. A very special thanks to Transit Thinker for their help producing this video.